Hi, I'm Matt. I've been using Pardot for around 6 years between different roles as an end user, an agency consultant, a freelancer, and a contractor. This session today is a follow-up to a workshop I ran at the Pardreamin event in December, where over 100 Pardot clients completed a hands-on exercise to benchmark the health of their Pardot org. Because the participants shared their audit data anonymously, even though this started as a training workshop, there were some big learnings from aggregating the metrics across over 100 orgs. And I believe this is the first publicly available Pardot benchmark data on this level of scale. So the session today is going to walk through those findings and what we can learn from them. So don't be discouraged from the very lengthy title. We're going to try and take away some actionable snippets of things that you can learn from this benchmark exercise that we did in December. So just moving on. Just first to introduce the methodology of the audit that we did. So we started with some training to make sure everybody could complete the task. And then I showed them how to follow the audit questions. Everyone participated and entered their results anonymously. And then we were supposed to review the results, but we just ran out of time. So that's what we'll do today. And what I've included in this slide is a few links in case anybody would like to participate in the audit. It's still actually open even today for you to have a go and test on your own org and find out your own results. So you'll see here, there's a couple of links. So we got a link to the slides if you want to follow on the presentation I did last time. Here's a link to enter your own stats based on your own audit that you can follow with the slides. There's also a results link where you can see all of the submissions that were made and an aggregation of the results. And then at the bottom, there's actually the recording from the last session in case you need the guided tour on how to do it all. So just to look at a couple of these links. First of all, we have the audit submission. So what this tells you to do is how to follow the questions, what to do in terms of setup in Pardot. So I've got some images to follow along with. So you would just enter your answers and then your submission is actually added to the results. So we got in here a Google Sheet. Again, that's linked back from the slides today. And this actually captures all the different submissions that we've had, all the metrics. It automatically calculates everything, and then it updates the master stats at the end. And this that we're looking at right now is what I'm going to capture in today's session in terms of looking at the results we had and what does it mean for the Pardot admin. So in the end, after cleaning up all the bad data we had from the session, we did have a couple of submissions that were nonsensical. People followed it wrong, but on the most part, pretty much everybody did it okay. And we had 128 good submissions. So as I mentioned, if you wanted to add your results to the file, feel free to follow those links at the bottom of the slides. The first metric that we benchmarked in the exercise was the average percentage of mailable prospects, and this one came out at 78%. So what does mailable prospects even mean? Across all the participating Pardot orgs, we calculate the percentage of prospects eligible to receive emails. So the first piece of terminology in there, and most of you familiar with Pardot will know what a prospect is, but a prospect is simply a member of your Pardot database. And this aligns with a lead or a contact in Salesforce. So for the experiment, we just calculated everybody who was eligible to receive emails and worked that out as a percentage of the total number of prospects in the org. And when we say the word mailable, second piece of terminology, mailable, it means that a prospect is not marked as opted out, bounced, or do not email. Essentially, it's somebody that we can send an email to in our Pardot org. So what does the 78% mean? Well, it tells us that on average, around a quarter of Pardot prospects in your orgs can't even be sent emails. So it's a fairly high number, really, and it tells us that maybe Pardot admins aren't spring cleaning their account regularly. So if you're watching this, it's worth yourself just having a look in your system and just asking the question of whether your marketing team has a good reason to be holding the data in Pardot that you can't send emails to. So why on average have Pardot.org's got 25% of the prospects in the system that just can't be sent to. So the really interesting thing here is that the actual number of mailable prospects will be even lower than what our audit calculation shows in the real world. So the limitation with how we measured this is that for clients using email preference pages, prospects can in fact opt out of specific communications without being counted as a globally opted out prospect in the account. So only accounts exclusively using this global unsubscribe option get an accurate number of opted out prospects. So yeah, in the real world, it's going to be even worse than 1 in 4 not being able to receive emails. And then if you did, or if you're going to do the audit yourself and you also score quite lowly on this metric, I wanted to give some kind of learning points and things to consider to take away. So the good thing about this metric is that unmailable prospects don't actually count towards your database limit. So if you are storing prospects that you can't send emails to, the good thing is that you're actually not paying for that as part of your Pardot subscription, because only mailable prospects are counted in your total database limit. But it's still worth, even though you're not paying for it, understanding why you're scoring low for the metric. So maybe you've got prospects who are opted out, or they're set as do not email, or maybe even both opted out and do not email. And each of these 3 different scenarios means a different thing. And what you'll need to do is tackle this in a different way in your Pardot.org. So if you've got lots of prospects who are just opted out, what this means is that they've actually clicked the unsubscribe link in a Pardot email or an email preference page. The other thing it could mean is that they've reported one of your emails as spam. The second scenario, if they're hard bounced, it means actually not that they're just hard bounced. It means that they could have, yes, a hard bounce, but alternatively, they could have had 5 soft bounces consecutively in a row. And the final scenario, if they're marked as opted out and hard bounced in Pardot, what this means is that they were either imported into your Pardot.org as a global opt-out prospect. Typically that happens when you've maybe been using something like MailChimp and you've got a load of previous unsubscribes that you want to just import into Pardot to make sure that you're not sending comms to them in error. It could mean that they've been marked as opted out in Salesforce, and that's synced through to Pardot with the Pardot to Salesforce connector. Or it could mean that they're manually opted out in Pardot by a user. So considering all these scenarios and what they mean, I put together some recommendations in terms of what you can do as an actionable takeaway. So for all those 3 scenarios, I really recommend reading this Pardot database cleaning guide. So this is a PDF that's provided by Salesforce, which guides you through best practice in terms of keeping your data clean. So it will actually cover on some really beneficial tips for all of those scenarios that we just looked at. The other one is that for each of those scenarios as well, I would recommend having a think about if you want to archive prospects, which means sending them to your Pardot recycle bin, if they don't want to receive communications from you, or if you've already imported them as globally opt-out, which was the option that I mentioned on the last screen, then you could just even send them to the recycle bin so that they're not showing as matching in any of your dynamic lists, which might confuse you in terms of the numbers that you're getting, but they will still be held as unmailable, even though they won't show up in any of your interface for your users. Alternatively, if you've got a lot of prospects who are set as opted out, I'd recommend looking at the prospect resubscribe feature in Pardot. Now, this is a relatively new addition, which I think that came out around towards the end of last year. And what prospects resubscribe allows you to do is if you've got prospects who are unsubscribed by clicking that global opt-out option in your emails, then if they come back to your website and submit another form, Pardot's smart enough to know that this person, if they are cookied, has previously unsubscribed and gives them the prompt to allow them to, in fact, opt back into your comms. So I've included a link in there to read more information on how to set that up. And the final scenario is if they're hard bounced, what you might want to do is have a bit of a data cleanse of any bounced emails. So try to, one thing I like to do is to show any bounced leads or contacts that are synced to a Pardot prospect, show them to sales reps in Salesforce using list views. And you can even use this Pardot hard bounce field, which can be displayed in Salesforce and synced onto that list view to show reps any records that clearly have an incorrect email address so that they can go in and fix them. The second metric that we looked at was the percentage of mailable prospects who have been emailed. So this one came out at 76%. In practical terms, what does this one mean? So mailable prospects who have been emailed means out of the people we can send emails to, this is the percentage that we do send emails to. So I like to see this as kind of a metric which tells us how effectively we are using our database. So we calculated this one by taking the number of mailable prospects in our Pardot org and dividing it by the number of prospects who have ever been sent an email to. So what we're trying to get here is a feel for database capacity and how well we're using it. So if around 25% of mailable prospects have never been sent emails, this means that Pardot customers are generally overpaying for the license subscription. So I did some really rough maths here, but our experiment gives an average of around 79,000 mailable prospects in each of the participating accounts. And the average account has emailed around 50,000 prospects that were mailable in the first place. So this equates to around 29,000 average prospects as an overage in terms of unneeded Pardot capacity for the database. Now, the UK pricing for prospect blocks is not actually publicly available, but I had a look, and in the latest USA pricing PDF, we can see that at the minimum pricing level, a block of 10,000 additional prospects is priced at $1,200 a year. So if we look at kind of how much prospects have been overpurchased, the average client's paying for around 2.9 blocks that they don't actually need. Now, if we look at the pricing website, again, Salesforce tells us that the Pardot Plus tier is the most popular. So it's the most commonly purchased tier. And the pricing for a 10,000 additional prospect block on the Plus tier is $1,800. So if we extrapolate this out across the experiment, $1,800 times 2.9 means that the average Pardot org or Pardot client is overpaying by just over $5,000 per year in terms of database capacity that they just don't use. So if you have a look at this metric in your own org and you see that you're scoring poorly for this, so you're not making the most of your database capacity, the first thing to have a look at is check if you're scoring low because you're using an email preference page. So as I mentioned earlier, there's this limitation that clients using an email preference page might have prospects who are mailable from a technical perspective, but unmailable from a permissions perspective, because they might have opted out from like particular comms that you send, but they're not marked as globally opted out. So if this applies to you, then that's fine. But if it doesn't apply to you, then it's worth having a look more closely at the prospect data, which you don't send emails to. So consider, why are these prospects in your database and should they still even be there? So the dynamic list that we created as part of the experiment brought back a list of prospects who had been emailed, but let's create a new dynamic list, if this applies to you, to fetch the records which haven't been emailed. So we can do that by filtering for prospects who are not on the list of mailable prospects who have received an email. So bit of a tongue twister, but you can just follow the logic here in the screenshot to set that up in your own org. So that's going to tell you everybody who can send an email, but you haven't sent an email to them. So what you want to do is click into some of these records, check out some of the prospects which match that dynamic list, and try to work out how did they enter your database in the first place. And the three main areas that I'd recommend to have a look at to get a quick feel for this would be the source campaign field, the conversion point field, and the Audit tab. So those will tell you really what were the source of these records, where did you capture them from, how did they become a prospect in the first place, and how's the data changed in them over time. So I kind of see that a good Pardot consultant is a bit of a detective at heart, and it's worth checking in your own org if this applies to you. If your prospects are missing key segmentation fields, why is that? So alongside checking individual prospect records for missing data, like I just showed, take a look maybe at the last 10 or 20 emails that you sent from your Pardot account across list emails and Engagement Studio start lists. And for those 10 or 20 emails, have a look at what the criteria were for who is sent the email. So were you using dynamic lists or were you using static lists? And if you were using dynamic lists, which fields were you actually using to build that list? Because it might be that if you're using, let's say, the industry field in your Pardot org to build your lists for targeting, you might have loads of prospects who are missing this data point, so you can't effectively target them with comms. I'll take another quick break for section 3. The third metric that we looked at was the average across all the Pardot orgs of prospects who were never active or not active in the last 6 months. And this came out at around 70%. So I know this one is probably the most confusing in terms of the name. I know it's a bit of a tongue twister. What this is trying to measure is which prospects haven't engaged with our marketing assets in the last 6 months. So the way that filtering works in Pardot, we have to also exclude prospects who've never engaged with our assets. That's where the never active comes from. Or the filter would include them because a blank activity date is technically not a date of greater than 6 months ago. So we have to say prospects never active or not active in the last 6 months to be able to see who hasn't engaged with our Pardot assets over the last X period. So in this case, 6 months. So in terms of measuring this one, this concept of a prospect being active, that is in Pardot when somebody interacts with, let's say, a link that we tracked, a landing page or a web page, or submitting a form. So this concept of being active just says that Pardot has detected that this particular member of our database has interacted with one of those things in the last X amount of time that we define. It's just important to flag here that email opens aren't counted in that, just because many spam filtering applications do open the emails just to check the content to make sure there's no viruses in there. So when we were building the dynamic list for this one, we used something called the prospect time filter on the dynamic list. In terms of what we can learn from this one, I think this metric is a really great indicator of understanding how engaged your database has been recently with your Pardot marketing activities. So we can see in this example, based on the data that we received back as part of the audits, on average, 70% of prospects haven't been active over the last 6 months. So that means that most people receiving your emails just aren't engaging with them. So I think in terms of perspective, to a marketer who's clicking a send button in Pardot, every email that they're churning out feels really important to them. But sadly, it's rarely the case for the recipient. So this metric really highlights the importance of considering every member of your database as an individual person and targeting them as specifically as possible to be really precise based on that segmentation information that you hold about them in your database. So if you do score poorly, which in this case is a high percentage, then there's some things to think about here. So the measurement of a prospect as being active revolves around this concept of a conversion in your Pardot org. So a conversion is when a cookied visitor on your website becomes associated with a prospect in your Pardot database. So to measure a prospect being active, they must have converted in the past. So really the big thing to take away is that you should be having a look at how you encourage your prospects to convert based on completing your web forms or clicking on CTA buttons in your email templates. I see that normally issues with these aspects go hand in hand with really low conversion rates. The other common reason for poor performance here is that maybe you're not actually sending emails to all your database. So this comes back to the previous section that we looked at around the percentage of your database that you send emails to. So it's only natural that you're going to consequently have a lower level of activity and engagement if you're not sending emails to all your audience that you can. So definitely go back, combine this dynamic list with the one in the previous section to get a feel for which prospects aren't engaging with your marketing assets because they've just not been sent emails to, versus the ones that you are sending emails to, but they're just not interested. The other one is also having a look at your click-through rates. So do you use things like A/B testing to understand what works well with your audience? Do you have SPF and DKIM authentication set up to ensure that your emails are actually delivered to them? And are your CTAs strong enough in your emails in terms of the style, the copy, and the rendering across all devices? Also do some analysis, as I previously said, around the source of your prospects. Are you targeting the wrong audience? And if you're definitely targeting the right audience, can you segment them more precisely to improve engagement, because what you're sending to them is really personalized around who they are and what they're interested in. If all else fails, just have a consideration around whether the prospects or maybe a subset of those prospects could be spring cleaned by putting them into your Pardot recycle bin, which is going to tidy up your account, free up your mailable database limit. Before you might want to do this, have a think about if you want to launch a re-engagement campaign as a bit of a last throw of the dice before you send them to the recycle bin. And don't worry, because if in future they do convert by submitting a web form, they'll come back out of your recycle bin. For the final metric that we had, this was that on average, a massive 5% of prospects were missing the first name field. How do we measure this one? Well, we used the dynamic list criteria for prospect field is empty, and we set that to the first name field. We then divided the number of prospects that were missing a first name by the total number of prospects in each account. And this was a really interesting one as well, because the point here wasn't really around understanding the level of which the first name field is populated. That's just one very small data point across many that Pardot clients use to personalize and segment their audience. So the real learning point here is actually to extrapolate this one and try to make the same calculation in your own org across all those different fields that are important for segmentation for you. Even so, the number of first names missing is surprisingly high for me. So 1 in 20 records on average is missing a first name. And this is normally seen when maybe new clients have a bit of a, I call it a MailChimp approach of just uploading email addresses for a particular email send, which they just see as kind of an email blast out to their audience. And one of the biggest mentality shifts for a new Pardot user is that you should consider Pardot not as just a tool to send individual emails out, but instead think of it as a long-term platform to build a valuable prospect database, which you're going to be able to come back to time and time again to build personalized audiences. So if you score poorly here, and this is a high percentage, it is a poor score here. So first of all, think about defining what your MQL criteria is. So I see that the most successful Pardot users have a defined set of data points required before a lead can be passed across from marketing to sales. So if you haven't already defined what your marketing qualified lead criteria is, and this just ensures that sales reps receive leads which are well qualified, consistent in quality, and are more likely to convert. So just ask yourself, could a sales rep work with a lead that doesn't even have a name? Of course, every sales process is different, but it's likely for most organizations that the answer to that question is a clear no. So think about auditing all those data collection points where prospects enter Pardot, whether it's through Pardot forms, imports, connectors, or even the API. Just try to ensure that you're not missing the chance to collect any data in fields which are required for your sales process. or you could put in a plan to collect them using Pardot functionality like progressive profiling on Pardot forms. Also, ask yourself, for prospects missing key data points, are those records really good data? So normally it's the sign of a bad quality data set being imported into your account when they're missing something as basic as a first name. And just ask the question also, do you even have permission to hold this data in your org? Have a think about sending those records to the recycle bin until they maybe submit a form and provide more complete information. Even if you don't hold a first name for a prospect, how can you actually be sure that you know enough about them to know who they are and which type of emails are you sending to them? Again, like in the previous section, have a think about, again, exposing those lead or contact records to your sales teams with list views in Sales Cloud. Maybe they know what the data is. Maybe they can enrich it for you. Maybe they even created those leads in the first place, but didn't populate all the fields that were needed. On the other hand, maybe you could work with a data vendor to enrich any records with missing information. So things like names, addresses, countries, industries, this kind of thing. You could also, I'd say a really good one to do is putting in a backup plan for any blank values that you're going to use for merge fields. So there's two ways to do this. I've included a couple of links in the slide there, but either by using default merge values or HTML statements to be quite savvy and personalize that data in a different way based on if the field is blank. I'd say the most valuable takeaway here is just that the first name is usually just the tip of the iceberg. So try to apply this approach to check other fields like last name, job title, maybe some address info like city and country. Most orgs typically have something like a business category or a business type, which is really important for segmentation, maybe an industry field, or even something like company size, so employees or turnover. We've got some bonus points. I'll leave these in the slides because I'm actually running out of time, but the two that I would have liked to do if I'd have had more time would be to look at prospects not synced with Salesforce and also prospects who have been over emailed. So I've included some info on the slide if you'd like to cover those in your own time. So that's everything. I'd say if I had to underline one takeaway from the session, it's that as a Pardot admin, making decisions on real data points is really important for you. So you should be trying to do this kind of health check exercise on a really regular basis. And I'd even recommend trying to track the metrics over time to see how they're changing and to try and catch any issues nice and early. So thank you.